Greetings, this is Ty Brown, and welcome to the Business of Creativity podcast, where we highlight leadership, management, and all things business. I'm here at UC Irvine, joined by Dr. Ian Williamson. Ian is the Dean of the Paul Mirage School of Business here at UC Irvine. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure to be here, Ty.
So I was listening to the news now is all over the place in terms of work, business, people getting fired. And one thing I heard was they were talking about the unemployment numbers.
Yeah.
And how it ties to whether raising the interest rate or lower the interest rate. And I have never necessarily completely understood that in terms of economics, but they said something, this was on NPR. And I started thinking, is it you want people to be employed because employment ties to tax revenue, and the way the business of our government should be set up is revenue is the income, and then you have expenses. So more people employed, then you get more people paying taxes. And then you think about more businesses have more people employed, so there's more people paying tax. Like, do you understand that part of the economics of it? Because I never thought about it like that. More people employed means more people paying taxes, so there's more tax revenue coming into the
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of variables there. Right? So let's sort of say this is a pretty complex story. In general, what you would want to say is that when you have low unemployment, certainly that represents opportunities for more tax revenue.
Yes, sir.
It typically is a byproduct of the fact that the companies themselves are doing well. So it's not just tax revenue from the individual employee. It's also tax revenue generated by the employer. That's going to vary depending on where you are in the country. Different states have different tax regimes in addition to whatever's going on with the federal government. But then the other side of that is you also are dealing with expenses in that scenario, because normally what happens is if you have high levels of employment, the expenses associated with social services at a minimum don't go up, right? So what would those social services be? Welfare benefits, housing benefits, healthcare costs, at least healthcare costs that are carried by the state, municipality, or the federal government, because those are being carried by the individual as well as potentially the employer, or in some combination of them. So, there's another side of this, which is the non-sort of financial aspect of that, which is we know that higher levels of unemployment are associated with lower levels of a whole host of negative social outcomes, right? So you're likely going to see, typically you're going to have longer lives in terms of people tend to engage in healthier behavior. They can afford to engage in healthier behavior. You tend to see lower levels of crime, and you also just have more stability in your community. So there's a bunch of and that tends to have implications for the expenses of a municipality as well. But that's the big picture. You're going to have more tax revenue in general from multiple sources. And in terms of social services, you'll have potentially lower demands on social services because there's going to be a segment which are probably the most disenfranchised, which you're going to need social services for. But those that are more on the fringe, that employment opportunity really does represent them having a path forward where they're not relying as much on that type of support or subsidy.
And in general, the country's more productive, so there's more productivity, output of whatever the output is.
Yeah, and productivity is an interesting one because you are generating more.
Yeah.
Whether or not you have a big jump in productivity, because productivity is typically thought of as a ratio. So as you add, it's not the absolute number. It's more like, as I get more people in, are they generating more per person? And, one of the big things that we know that drives it, the two biggest ones typically are education and technology, right? Those are the big boosts that tend to make every society anywhere on the planet more productive.
Yeah. So I'll tell you where the conundrum in my head is thinking about that. Because I was trying to explain to my nephew a few years back when he was living with me after he graduated high school about taxes. I said, if you think about the country like a business, you got to have revenue and you got to have expenses.
Yes.
And if taxes are always being cut, you're always lowering revenue. So the conundrum in my brain was, yes, you want people employed so that more people have jobs, more individual taxpayers, but then businesses are booming so they could pay taxes. But then you get to the point where we are now where it seems like there's a stretch between the businesses doing well, economy doing well, but then a lot of people aren't feeling that. So now it's like, well, if the formula was bringing in revenue from, you know what I mean? So there's where that gap right there is like everybody doesn't see that gap.
Well, now we're bringing. So what I gave you was the very simplified answer. Now we're moving into the complexities, right? Because now we're starting to deal with some very different philosophical beliefs, right? So one of the complexities is, at what point does the tax regime create a disincentive for people to invest, right? So one logic is, if you make the taxes too high, companies will be less likely to want to invest. Entrepreneurs and investors will be less likely to invest because they're not getting as much of return on what they're providing, right? And so that's a logic that, you can think about it. That's a very simplified version of that logic, which then perpetuates into things like, well, we want to have a tax regime low because then you get more investments. And even though you won't have as much direct tax on that organization, you get broader investment and the base gets bigger, right? There's a version of that is sort of the logic that's oftentimes provided around like the trickle-down effect.
Economics.
Right. Right. So that's sort of a version of that. And sort of you want to have a tax regime that doesn't stifle investment. Right. Now, there's another side of that says, well, the tax base, the tax regime, or the tax amount can be high if the services that the taxes are providing are enabling business growth. So, what would that look like? Infrastructure and education, education, and safety. So, these are costs that companies in general have no interest in bearing. They represent direct negative costs for them, and they themselves typically are not of a scale where they can actually make a meaningful solution to those issues. They can put some money into infrastructure, but they can't build a highway, right? They have no interest in doing that. They can't maintain a highway. They don't really ever want to put money into education. They'd much rather hire fully formed, functional employees. So somebody's already educated, and they typically don't want to deal with healthcare. Right? That's not, unless you're a healthcare organization, that's not a core competency of yours. So all of these things, and they desperately need healthy employees, right? Because that absenteeism, turnover, and other way. So alternative perspective around that is, well, it's not necessarily how high the taxes are. It's the value that the taxes are creating to enable business environments, right? So we'll make an investment into spaces where we know that the other costs are carried by other entities, largely the government. So you have competing philosophies going on here. And then there's the who do we believe should get the reward for the investment, which is a whole nother story. So yeah, you can start adding in different perspectives on that. I think one of the core issues that as a country we're dealing with, and this is certainly very real for every municipality and state, is when the expenses are higher than the revenue. 100%. Right? Like this is, there is no company that can survive like that. There is no municipality or county or state. The only entity that can survive like that for long periods of time is the federal government. And then there's a question around how long can the federal government do that?
Yeah.
Right. And that's where a lot of people are raising a lot of concerns, because they can only really do that by borrowing money. And do people have confidence in that entity that they will pay it back?
Yeah, the last long enough, but they would pay
for me to get my dollar back.
Yeah, right, exactly. Which is interesting.
That's the crux of the issue we're dealing with right now.
That's where we find ourselves. You talk about like politics, right? And my mother was a special ed teacher, right? And so education has always been important to me and my family. So
my mother was a grammar school teacher, by the way.
What, really?
Yeah, 6th, 7th, 8th grade.
So I tend to look at where whoever in whatever position is running, where are they in education? Because in my mind, if education isn't important, like you said, these companies may make a lot of money, but investing in education doesn't make sense. We just hire somebody who's already educated. If other countries are better at educating their people, then these companies are hiring people that are already educated from other countries, because we're not.
So I should note, I'm not an economist, right? So I'm giving you my
This is what I need.
Right. I'm not gonna, and I have to say that to give credit to my economist colleagues who can go deep on this.
I don't know if I would be able to have that conversation.
I am an HR professional, though, right? So this is my expertise. My PhD is in organizational behavior. My research is all around talent management. So I can maybe go a little deeper on that. And what I'll say is that we know throughout pretty much all the data that's been collected over time that education is a multiplier, right? So if you think about what does a person bring, we got muscles and energy, right? If you multiply that times education, we tend to find a way to use that energy more productively, right? That's just basic. And if you add in some additional tools, right, that you get another multiplier, right? And so that's the technology typically that we're talking about. Why this story about education, I think, particularly right now, is so important is the nature of the activity that actually drives our economy has shifted. We were agricultural society. We still are, but it's a very, very small part of our GDP. It's a very small part of the gross domestic product that we generate. We were a major manufacturing powerhouse, but today that's less than 15% of our GDP. And what we are and what we are great at is we are a service economy.
Exactly.
All right. So now the muscle that is generating a lot of the value is the brain. It's not the back, it's not the legs, right? And so where do you actually get the biggest bang for the buck or the biggest return is when you take that muscle, the brain, and really build it up, and that's education. So service economies thrive when they have highly educated people. This has certainly been the story of California, definitely the story of Southern California. And when you look at the margins associated with service economies, by and large, they tend to be higher, right? And so the profit that you can generate off of a service offering in most cases, not always, but in many cases is much more sustainable. That's important because as you move into that space, that allows you to have higher quality of life, right? That allows you to make the investments and all the various different things that give us a higher quality of life. And also, of course, a service economy generates a lot of services that improve the quality of our life. Healthcare, for example, is a service economy that's makes us live longer. So I always sort of say in the service economy, the two things you can never jeopardize is education and health, because you need really smart people to live a long time. Because the other thing about our knowledge, while it certainly can become obsolete, we tend to get better with the more we use it. That's called wisdom. Right. And, older people have more opportunity to use it, so they tend to be wiser. And so you really, we're aging as a population. The average age has been going up dramatically. And you're going to have, more and more, the fastest growing part of the population in the workforce is over 65. So you're going to have a lot of people that, up until recent history would have never been part of the workforce. Now they're going to be an important component of the workforce, which is fine because they have expertise, they have wisdom. If we can continue to educate them and upskill them around new tools, they can be extremely productive, much longer than, say, when we were agricultural-based or manufacturing-based society.
One thing I heard you say something about service on another podcast. And one thing you mentioned, you talk about manufacturing, and most of our workplace and workforce and even the education system was built around leading people towards a manufacturing way of doing things, right? That set way of doing things for all the various things that we produce. And then you said now, the value can be found in personalizing service for, I guess, the customer. So there still seems like there has to be set processes for the company in order to provide the service they provide, and then customize it for the individual. Tell me about it.
Yeah, so certainly you're going to have parameters around what you can and cannot do, the financial models associated with that, the legality associated with that. Like, I would not want to have an unfettered environment where people could just do whatever, because we know people are going to do whatever. That said, what a lot of companies, I look at my organization, right? So we have a curriculum. We certainly guide our faculty as to the core topics or the learning outcomes. But, we differentiate ourselves on the discretion of our faculty. right? So finance is finance to a certain extent. But the thing that makes a person excited about taking a finance class here or a management class here or an accounting class here is the discretion of that academic to help that person understand when and why would you use this, how might you interpret that, where would you experiment with that, where do they get that from? That's from their expertise. And the classroom, as well as their research, provides them with discretion to actually use that expertise to come up with a novel point, a differentiating point. The ability to sort of sit down with a student says, you want to go into investment banking, you want to focus in on entertainment in investment banking. I have research that I've done on that particular space, and I can guide you on doing that versus the textbook story as to what investment bankers do.
Yeah.
Right. So, I think at a high level, that is actually what makes most companies make money. It is trusting that I have given the right parameters to my workforce, but within those parameters, they understand how to use their discretion to create value for each of our clients. And we multiply that out, and that's when you get a value proposition that begins to differentiate you versus some other organization that may not have they may not create the level of space for discretion, or they may not have enough trust in their workforce to use that discretion in a way that's useful.
Yeah.
Right? This is where you want to get the best employee. Typically, the best employee is the one that has the right type of experience and the right level of education.
Yeah. What's interesting in what you're saying is that can be applied to the organization, but it also can be applied to the individual when you're talking about your unique value proposition.
Of course.
Right?
Yeah, of course. So, I always say if I'm working with the organization and they want me to come in and think about how do we create a better workforce, one of the things I always think about is, okay, give me the 5 people that you think are doing really well here. Give me the 5 people that are not doing so well. 5, 10 people in the same role, broadly speaking, 5 doing great, 5 doing not so great. What you'll find is that they have the same role. They typically have the same performance expectations. But in critical incidents, the 5 people who are doing well, they're making different decisions based on their discretion than the 5 people who are not doing well. And they're consistently making that decision. It may not be the same decision, but they're consistently figuring out what to do when. The clients love it in some particular way. And for the 5 that aren't performing well, they're consistently either not making that decision or making a decision and it's the wrong one. And why is that? Because they have a certain skill. And it could be correlated with their education, their experience, some combination of both. And that's when you begin to say, well, that's the high performing workforce that we want. And, that multiply that out, right, by 5, 10, 1,000, whatever. And now you begin to see why some companies outperform other companies, why some regions outperform other regions, and ultimately why some countries outperform other countries.
Is there, you being and I'm gonna categorize this, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, being a talent management expert, right?
Sure, I'll take it.
Okay, you being talent management expert. That actually is probably not even a high enough title. But anyway, you being a talent management expert. I had this phrase. I wrote a book with a friend of mine a long time ago. It was for young professionals. It was called The Blueprint for a Successful Career, a foundation for developing young professionals. And the developing was a play on words, right? You're either developing young professional or you're a leader who's developing young professionals, right? And so my part of the book was just how you create the environment, the environment that people want to be a part of, young folks. His part was kind of the story of he's a young professional, right? Yeah. And one of the questions I thought leaders should ask themselves is working for me more than just another paycheck, right? Meaning like, am I finding value in this company? Do I find as much value in the company as the company finds in me? Or am I just trading time for money? And when you talk about talent management and people's unique value proposition, I guess the question comes, if you're the organization, how do we continue to filter so that we get more of these 5 people, and these 5 who aren't as productive as these 5, we replace them with 5, right? Like, is that the nature of the transactional nature of companies? You want to be able to get the best human capital, so you got to get rid of people who aren't. So tell me about the aspect of that. Right?
I mean, I think it's a make and buy story, right? So the buy side of that is you're always trying to hire new people that you think are going to add to the sum of talent that you have in the organization. In some cases, one of the big reasons why you would do that is the thing that you're doing, the business model you have, the environment you're in has changed. So, a lot of companies, a lot of established firms right now are in very high profile ways going out paying a lot of money to hire people with expertise in artificial intelligence, for example. You hear a lot of news stories about that. They were established firms. They were doing well. Uh, it's not like they failed. It's not like the people they had were bad, but the environment changed, and they're saying we don't have the ability to make that talent. We can't teach ourselves this fast enough, or maybe not at all. And so as a result, we're going to go out and we're going to bring in people who are more ready-made. They've already kind of got that skill set, and we're going to try to bolt that into what we're doing. Conversely, what you'll find is most successful organizations cannot sustain success over time if all they're doing is buying, right? Because there is a coordination aspect where human beings, we do things in social settings. And there's a coordination aspect of how we interact that actually generates tremendous value. And so you just can't, I guess one of the classic examples, and I'll use a sports analogy because I like sports and many people do. But there was the big question about how in the world could a U.S. basketball team lose the gold medal in the Olympics? Clearly, the people on that team were more talented than the people on, say, Argentina, to use an example, right? And I've had the pleasure of meeting members of that Argentinian team that beat the U.S. team. And they're phenomenal basketball players. None of them would have said, though, that they were as good as the best basketball players on that U.S. team, but they were highly coordinated. They liked each other. They practiced all the time. They trained together. They had a mechanism of interacting that was just superior to that team that didn't have that luxury, right? So you can't always just buy. Sometimes you got to make. And this is where companies, how do you make? You train, but you also provide people experiences that allow them to get better, that allow them to experiment. And I think this is actually on the employee side, going back to the book that you were describing, where there is this transaction of I have a skill and I'm giving it to you and you pay me, right? But the thing that makes it sticky, the reason why I don't necessarily leave just because somebody else is willing to pay me more, is that you are creating a platform for me to continue to get better at what I do. You're giving me interesting experiences. You're giving me the opportunity to experiment around different things. You're giving me trial and error opportunities. You're giving me feedback. So these are all things that are more social. They're more intrinsic in nature that actually people resonate strongly to, but they also make them better at being a knowledge worker.
Yeah.
And I think, when you talk to knowledge workers, if I look at my students, they're very savvy about this. They will trade off more money for more engaging, interesting, thought-provoking experience. They'll trade off a more interesting job from a work perspective to work in an environment where they're going to get more support from their colleagues, peers, and supervisors, because they know that that actually helps me become a better professional. And of course, if I have an environment where I don't get a lot of support and the work that I'm doing is not necessarily building my skill set, then now it's more of a transaction. It boils down to how much are you paying me,
Yeah. 100%.
right? And
I'm just gonna do this here.
I'm just going to do this while I
Yeah.
can.
Yeah.
But even in those situations, they'll say, I know I can't do that forever because at some point my skill set doesn't get rejuvenated and I can become obsolete.
Yeah. Yeah. The key question, I guess, is for the individual. For the leader, is working for you more than just another paycheck. For the individual, to keep it in the parlance that we've used, is, am I helping my employees increase their unique value proposition?
Yeah. And even though we are oftentimes very short term in terms of how we think about things, we tend to think about things like our career over a longer period of time. So yes, I want to maximize how much money I want to make, but I'm probably going to be in this profession for 30 years. And I don't want to be, pigeonholed, or I don't want to be left behind because I didn't have the opportunity to experience something new. And, the other thing you have to always understand is most people, the vast majority of us, are just very curious. So intrinsic motivation around variety, creativity, exploration, that just is going to generate effort on our part no matter what.
Yeah, it's interesting talking about the unique value proposition of the individual and of the institution or the organization. One of the interviews I saw you do, I think when you first got here, it was like Meet the New Dean, right? And the question was asked about fundraising, development, philanthropy. And you said, well, our unique value proposition are the conversations that we have. And we need to go out and look at the relationships we have or that we will develop to see if they want to be a part of these conversations, right? And I wonder about your lens now. We're 4 or 5 years on.
Yeah.
In terms of, do you feel like you have increased the unique value proposition, A, of the individuals who are the students coming out, but then also B, of the institution, the Mirage School of Business?
I think so. I was very fortunate. I came to lead an organization that was a high performing organization, right? So we had a lot of great things going on, and it was my role to, I'll say, refine that, really more focus. So not everything that is relevant in business can we be uniquely great at, right? There's some things that we have to make sure we do well, but there have to be a few set of things that we're very committed to saying we're going to just invest the time and energy and money, if necessary, to just stay at the forefront of that. One of those areas was technology, and really being clear that we are always going to be interested in putting the time in to understand how technology is shaping a business model, a business practice, or maybe even an industry setting or sector. And to do that, well, I mean, we are not necessarily always going to be leading that. The industry partners might be leading that. So are we going to do the work necessary to ensure that we're talking with them, getting their insight, and then using that as an input into our expertise? One example of that was really thinking about, we have a Dean's Advisory Board. They are a collection of senior leaders in our community. We invite them to join that advisory board as a means to give us advice about where we should be heading as a school. We were very deliberate in identifying leaders to join that board that were coming from sectors that we thought were representing the future of the Orange County business community. So healthcare, medtech, artificial intelligence, really wanting to make sure that we got that capability in, because they're going to help us understand how to direct our efforts to make sure we're having the right conversation. And I always say that, the conversation that is impactful on your life. And in fact, if you think about what happens for a person, the things that tend to impact our behavior most are pivotal conversations, right? There's always things that might happen physically that allow us to do something or prevent us from doing something. But most times, a lot of the decisions that are most pivotal are pivotal if in terms of decisions we make, are conversations. And it was a combination of the right topic with the right person, right? So the right topic, it's timely, it's relevant, it's useful today and going forward. It's not something that happened in the past that won't show up again. It's the right topic, it's the right person. They're knowledgeable, and they can share something that's complementary to my understanding. It can't be completely different, because then I don't understand the word they're saying. Like, literally, they're speaking Greek then. I don't understand. But it's complementary, right? And they have that right expertise, and then it's curated in the right way, right? So we have a norm of listening and responding, of having trust. And so what we try to do here is actually follow that to say, when you're in our environment, we want to try to have as many pivotal conversations for you in your life, particularly as it pertains to you making choices about your career, your profession. So do we get the right topics? That's where that advisory board plays a huge role. Do we have the right people? We've hired quite a few new faculty since I've joined, all designed to bring in new expertise in things like sustainability, artificial intelligence, fintech, healthcare, right? So we're bringing in the right expertise and then working on the norms of how we as a community interact.
Yep.
One of the norms that I oftentimes talk about is, I think smart communities are communities that have multi-generational conversations, right? Because you get to the young people bring what's happening now. The middle-aged people they're in the know of the practicalities of getting things done. And the older generation brings a wealth of understanding around context. And, so how do we get our alums from multiple generations to engage with us? Because that's how we all get better, and I think about my family. I'm from Chicago. I grew up on the South Side. I have a very tight-knit family. Thanksgiving is a big deal for us. And a lot of the knowledge of our family is developed at that Thanksgiving dinner, because we have 3, if not 4 generations sitting around the table. Older generation providing context. That happened before. This is what happened. The current generation sort of saying, this is the day-to-day. The younger generation saying, have you seen this new thing? Right? And that's how we get better.
You think about what you just said here in terms of conversations, right? You have advisory board that makes sure the topics of conversations are correct, right?
Yes.
And you have, I guess, for the lack of a better word, the students who you're making sure they're educated on the topics that we've just deemed to be correct.
Right. And that's who we're curating this conversation for at the end of the day, for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you want to have the community to provide context on the topics of conversation.
Yeah. So they provide the opportunity to experiment.
Yeah.
Right. So this is the internships. This is the thought leadership events. This is the competitions that we have. Right. So we're creating, because, when you first start with something, very few of us can get up in front of a large audience and give a phenomenal speech without any prep or rehearsal. Nobody does that. And not many of us, right? We would have had, not many musicians can do that. Not many athletes can do that, right? There's this thing called practice, and it makes you better typically. But to practice means you have to have an audience that is supportive, that gives you feedback, that gives you guidance, and that's what this is. This is the practice field, and we're preparing you for the playing field, whatever that might be. And so are we giving you, if you think about our faculty and our staff as the coaches, right? Are we giving you the right coaches that are allowing you to work on your game, work on how you're positioning yourself, and then giving you opportunities to play with that. So maybe it's an exhibition game as opposed to a tournament game, right? And you just kind of build that up. And so that now when you go off, you have the confidence to know that when I present myself in that interview, when I'm presenting myself on that project in my company, when I'm pitching my company to an investor, this is not the first time I've been here.
Yeah. So does that, now walk with me here,
Yeah, please.
because to me that sounds like a way of assessing the environment when you were thinking about taking a job, and then when you became the dean. I mean, assess the environment. What are the conversations? Who's advisors on topics? Does that translate? Because it sounds to me that you have done work with organizations in terms of their environment too. How does that translate to a business? It seems like things might translate directly, or it might be a little different.
No, I think it's very direct. And I would say the logic I'm using for this is pretty much the same logic I would use for any of the companies I've done consulting with. I always say all opportunities for success and failure for every organization starts from outside the organization. It's the external environment. Managers, leaders in an organization, we obsess over what we're doing to make our organization better. We can sometimes obsess to the point where we think all of our success and all of our failure is driven by what we do, because this is the thing that we control and we spend all our time thinking about. And that's just not true, right? There's stuff that happens outside of your organization that will, federal government change, new change in technology, natural disaster. Like, I don't care how good you are, that's going to change your trajectory. Sometimes positive, so you get to freeload. Like the wave came in, you didn't become a better sailor, it just pushed you faster. Or sometimes negative, right? Where it acts as a constraint, and no matter what you're doing, the wind is just not at your back, right? And so you have to appreciate that. So one, understand what are those things. So
Those are the topics of conversation.
That's right. We got to talk about that.
Yeah,
and so you got to be able to pick that up fast. Organizations that are struggling do not pick that up fast enough. Some of them don't see it at all. They typically go out of business. But the businesses that are really good, they see it faster. They make sense of it faster. They're talking to people who can educate the leaders, because the leaders are the ones that go back and say, given that this has happened, should we reorganize what we're doing? Right? So should we then change our strategy? The strategy is the stuff that we focus on. And in our context, like, think about it directly. It's the curriculum we teach. That's the topic that we're going to curate. Should we change that? So, we've been having a lot of conversations with tech organizations, and, 2021, 2022, we're like, artificial intelligence, we need to start thinking about this, right? And so we had enough confidence because of the conversations we were having externally to say, this is a meaningful disruption. So then let's start a process of experimentation, right? So we changed our activities. And then after a while, you get some feedback and you go, okay, now we're fully committed. And now you make some wholesale investments. This is the path forward for us. So, for example, we are running a training program for all of our faculty and staff on upskilling them around the use of GPTs, right? And how that should be part of their story, because I can't just go out and buy, although I have hired new experts in, but, we also want to build up the people that are here. And, one simple thing is like, if we haven't changed who we're talking to, and we haven't changed the behaviors that we have, and we haven't changed who we're hiring, how is it that we're equally relevant today as we were 5 years ago? It's just not possible, unless the world hasn't changed, and that doesn't pass the litmus test.
So the customer in that assessment strategy, right? The advisory board topic, and then that applies to who we are in our strategy on the inside.
Who we hire from our faculty and our staff,
And then
what we
the
teach.
students are the service we're providing. We're providing service to the students.
Also-
Totally similar to the customer.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So, I think right now, if I was a financial institution, I'm going to get a lot of questions around how are you using more precise data to manage my finances? How are you using, say, artificial intelligence to provide me with real-time ability to ask questions to get information about my accounts? Things that would have been physically impossible or perhaps unaffordable if I was solely relying upon a person, right? So you're going to get that request because the expectation's been set. The expectation was set not because of something that you did wrong, but because the environment around you changed.
What would be the equivalent of the community, the younger, the middle-aged, the context of wisdom in the business world?
I think you see that in your workforce, right? Because you're going to have the entry-level individuals. We produce them. Please hire them, right? You're going to have the managers that have the 10 years of experience. And then you're going to have the senior leaders who, probably to be a senior leader in a complex organization, that's like 2 decades worth of expertise. I look at myself, I've been in this for 2 decades. I had a career, over the course of my career, I've led the way in my faculty around research. That is not my story today because I don't have some of those skills that the faculty I'm hiring out of my PhD programs today have. But, I kind of also know a little bit more about how all this all fits together than I did when I was an assistant professor just starting off.
This is that adaptable leadership I've heard you talk about.
Right. Like my value proposition to the organization is shifted.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I need to create value in a different way. Maybe I'm more enabling my assistant professor who has the cutting edge technical expertise. I'm probably being mentored by that person on that capability, but they won't have the context to understand when and how to use that to maximize their career or their impact in the profession, or the way to overcome some of the natural things that you perhaps experience as a professor when you're teaching, right? And they definitely don't have the time as they're mastering that technical expertise to figure out, well, what does the new federal government rule mean for us? Not us collectively and me individually. That's not they don't have the time to do that. And maybe not even the expertise to do that. So, I definitely have that. I mean, I have 18 to 70. I think right now, over 18 to over 75 in terms of the age of my workforce.
Yeah, that's excellent.
So I got everything.
Yeah. Okay, I'll ask a couple questions and then we'll wrap. First one is, in terms of self-assessment, like you mentioned, right? Your value proposition is evolving.
Yeah.
Tell me about that process of thinking about yourself and assessing yourself.
So first off, what is the expectation of the role? Right. So I can assess myself on a lot of things. In this context, I'm the dean. There's a thing that I get assessed on as it pertains to that. So where am I spending my time? Right. So there's outcomes. We can get to outcomes, but I actually think of the behavioral inputs that lead to those outcomes. First thing, I need to always be very mindful about where I'm spending my time because that's a big predictor of whatever outcome I'm going to generate. Do I understand what happened? Why? That's very important for me in my role, because if I don't appreciate that, if it was a mistake, I'm going to repeat it. And if it was a success, I'm not going to repeat it.
Right.
And so a portion of my time, maybe a third, needs to be assessing, do I understand what happened last year? Do I understand what happened in the last 3-4 years? Do I have a good perspective and a context for our organization? Without context, I'm definitely going to make bad decisions. And so me sitting down, for example, with my chief operating officer to review our budgets for the last year, and saying, well, what happened? What didn't happen? That's actually really important, right? Because it gives me context. Am I making sure that we're operating well? So am I spending time with my line managers and asking them the right questions to get the right immediate feedback to either deal with the fire that we're dealing with or preventing the fire? Do I understand? I'm not going to ever understand their areas to the level of detail that they do, but do I have enough understanding to ask the right questions to pull that together? Right? Because I need to sort of have my marketing person appreciate what's going on in my master's program area. I'm never going to have the mastery of marketing that person has. And I'm never going to have the mastery of sort of student recruitment that my master's program person has, but I definitely can understand where they can need to link up, right? So am I spending the time doing that? And then am I guiding us to the right destination? And so I need to spend about a third of my time really focusing on what are the trends that are happening. And I actually feel like perhaps more than anyone else in the organization, I have to get that right, because I do make decisions about how we allocate resources. And if I put them in the wrong bucket because I didn't see what was coming, there's no coming back from that. There's no hard work that overcomes doing great at the wrong thing.
Yeah.
Right. And so I have to say, am I going out externally? Am I talking to people externally? Am I giving myself global exposure? Because we're an international entity. We're an international industry. So I spend time doing that because I know that it will give me the right inputs to shape my outcomes. And then you get to, okay, do we manage our resources well? All right, that's a budget story. You can evaluate the outcome on that. How are we doing on student recruitment? Are we getting our accreditation? Are our rankings appropriate? Are we raising funding? I always think of fundraising as we get money when we're doing things that are seen as relevant to the community. If we're doing things that aren't so relevant to the community, good luck trying to raise money for that, right? But that would suggest that we understood what the community needed. How do we find that out? We talked to them, right? We talked to them before maybe they even had the need. So that's kind of how I think of my schedule, my day, and then, we can get into more details about it, but that's sort of the general principles.
Yeah, no, I got it. I'm going to try to rehash too, right?
Yeah.
So, what are your priorities in terms of time? Where am I spending my time?
Yeah, because that's pretty much all I bring. I mean, they don't ask me to lift much these days.
Yeah, right.
So
where am I spending my time? And then it's understanding the context of where you fit, right? And then it's, are we operating well?
Yeah, definitely got to get that right.
Right. And then it's, am I leading us in the right direction?
Yes.
Right. And then you can look at outcomes and am I hitting these KPIs or whatever?
Yeah, because, I have to, the role I have is one that has a responsibility of making sure that we're doing well today. But I work for a higher education institution. We're 60 years old this year. One of the things that motivated me to work in higher ed is that I think over time universities have the ability to be one of the most transformative entities in community. But you don't think of a university as being around for just 10 years and then being sold. I operate under the impression that we're a forever organization, that we will forever be here, that there will never be a day when Orange County won't need a business school, right? So I have to make decisions that make sure that we're doing well today. We take great pride in the success that we have today. But I also have to make decisions that mean that the person that follows me, whenever that comes, is inheriting something that has a lot of momentum. Yeah. And that may mean maybe sacrificing some of the things that we could do today to set us up for, I always joke, I'm the 12th person to be the dean here. So there was 11 people that set me up, right? They all made, throughout the history of the school, critical decisions that gave us a platform. I didn't build this building, and I didn't build the one next door. That was 2 deans ago and then 4 to 5 deans ago. So, they set me up. And now I got to think about, what do I need to do for the 13th person, right? At the end of the day, the most important decision I should be making is actually for that 13th dean. Yeah. If because I'm not flipping this organization. We're not going public. We're not,
Are you leaving it better than you found it, right?
It has to be.
So last question, relative to the things you said, that process of looking at where you spend your time, the context of it all, are we operating efficiently, and then where are we going? Tell me how that translates into personal evaluation, right? In your personal life, not just the role of dean, but who you are as a husband, who you are as a family man, those types of things.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of a same story there, right? Because if I think about my role as a parent, I have 3 children. You know, there's more than enough going on with 3 kids to keep you overwhelmed with just the day.
Yeah.
But you also got to start thinking about, the hardest things you ever do as a father is knowing your child has a high probability of falling down, but you let them fall down. You do not do that for today. Today, they're gonna cry, they're gonna be hurt. You're gonna be terrified that they can actually hurt themselves in a way where it's really, really bad. But you also know that they need to have the practice field where they actually learn that I fell down. Okay, maybe don't do that. Now, I got up. Okay, that's possible too. If they don't, when are they gonna learn that lesson?
Yeah.
And so that's a lesson that they hold on to and they draw upon 20 years from now.
The context of where they're going.
Yeah. And so I have to kind of not just be there to make sure they're doing all right. They need to be able to be okay today.
Yeah, that's the operational part.
Right. But I got to also think about putting them in situations that prepare them. I always say my job at the end of the day, I love my children, but my job as a parent is to create a fully functional adult.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some uncomfortableness that they have to go through for that. And it's not just them. Like, now that I'm a parent, I think about some of the decisions I was making as a child, and I go back to my parents and I'm like, you must have just been terrified. Like, how did you not step in?
You run the streets of LA all through the night.
Like, how did you not step? You had to know that this was potentially going to go bad. But you also needed to have a situation where I had enough space to figure it out because, I can't be there all the time. And so I think there's truth to that as well. And then I also think, like, one of the things that as a family you get strength around is it's important to come together and reminisce about what is past, right? Because it gives you confidence. It gives you pride. It gives you, like, a sense of, like, purpose. And so it's okay to, like, tell the stories about what happened 5 years ago, like, because it grounds you, right? And, you don't ever want your kids to not understand where they came from and who they are. And that's the stories.
And that's what that does is sharpen their unique value proposition.
So I think there's some parallels to it. But, I think it's a much more all-encompassing job as a spouse, as a parent, than it is for this. And nobody else is raising my kids. I got nobody to lean on, so it's on me. It's on me.
Dr. Williamson, this has been an excellent conversation. I really appreciate you joining us here on the Business of Creativity podcast.
It is my honor, my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. That was Dr. Ian Williamson. He is the Dean of the Paul Mirage School of Business here at UC Irvine. And of course, I am Ty Brown with the Business of Creativity podcast. And keep in mind, the role of a leader is to create and maintain an environment that people want to be a part of. And as always, be better tomorrow than you are today.